Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for Series 10 of our series on how to work with the child protection system. On this occasion, I want to talk about trauma. I want to talk about trauma because it is a primary issue and a problem within the child protection system itself. I need to say before we start that trauma is something that we all experience, that there's hardly anybody on this planet that hasn't gone through some degree of trauma, whether that be the fact that perhaps they felt unloved by their parents, that they didn't get the hugs that they needed, or they felt rejected or abandoned by their parents and maybe some other members of their family. In some way, many of us have encountered a trauma. And then there are those people, of course, who encounter serious traumas. The death of somebody, perhaps. A child might have been sexually abused as a child, might have been physically assaulted, might have been mentally and psychologically abused. All of these things are traumas. Now, the issue that we're faced is, how do we deal with traumas? How do we manage them? And how do we understand our own trauma and how that has impacted our lives? The reality is that if we haven't thought about or evaluated or reflected upon the traumas that we've had in our lives, and we haven't come to terms with them in a way, we haven't been able to articulate them, we haven't understood where they sit emotionally in our lives, and we haven't particularly analysed how it impacts our current behaviour. Now, there's a lot in all of that. And if we haven't had the time to work some of these issues out, then clearly our behaviour is going to be affected by whatever happened to us as a child. It's interesting to note that for parents whose children have been removed, that most of those parents have experienced some sort of childhood trauma themselves. Those traumas that the parents have encountered never get addressed by the child protection system. They never get discussed or have parents allowed to work through them. The child protection social workers will often tell people that if you've got a particular trauma in your life, and we suspect that you have, and that's fair enough because most of us do, then they expect you to go away and find some particular miraculous trauma counsellor who will be able to help you to work through those issues. What they fail to understand is that they themselves, the workers that is, have traumas in their lives that they have failed to work through. If we're going to suggest that trauma is something that most of us have and that we fail to understand how that trauma impacts us as adults, in other words, how we're responding around some of those traumas, then we're probably ignoring our own behaviour and what is impacting that, or the reasons why we might choose to behave in certain ways. I suspect that many of the workers within the child protection system carry their own sense of trauma, but they fail to understand how it impacts the type of work that they do. They may see parents, for example, as bad parents because they themselves, in some cases, had experienced parents who treated them poorly, not realising that their efforts to punish other parents is their own effort to psychologically punish their own. That they themselves might have had troubled childhoods and no one came to rescue them. And so, therefore, their task is to rescue every child because they know what it feels like to be abused at some level. So these things have to be addressed. We have to have the space to talk about the trauma that all of us experience and how it impacts us. It's important also to understand where the emotions sit around trauma. So as a child, it's unlikely, well, it's just likely, that we will not be able to form language to describe what it is that has happened to us in our early childhood. It's not until we're older that we're able to define what that is, to seek out the language, the appropriate language to describe it. And even then we're lousy at it. We use words like hurt, sad, frustrated and angry to describe all the emotional pain that we feel. We don't talk about being betrayed, we don't talk about our level of resentment, and we don't talk about other words that may better describe how it has been for us as children. What we're doing within the child protection system is we're re-traumatising parents by not understanding their own trauma and how that's impacted them, not understanding the workers' trauma and how their work impacts them and how they might be acting out their version of their trauma when it comes to dealing with parents and children. So at some level, we need to start thinking about trauma a little differently. There's a process called trauma-informed practice, which helps us to evaluate what the trauma is that sits in someone's lives. There was a time some years ago in practice, I was often told that you can't talk to somebody about their trauma because it will simply reignite it, that it will trigger some sort of response. That's not true. It's a fallacy, always has been, always will be. We need to be able to try to find ways to confront the trauma that people have had in their lives. And the only way we can do that, really, is by respecting them, by liking who they are, by caring for them, by nurturing them, because primarily that is what the child wants. I'm going to cite an example from my own experience, which may help you to understand what this means. When I was about 5 or 6, I made a small table. Now, I remember this incident quite clearly because I was reminded of it some years later, many years later, after my father had passed away. He left a whole host of a whole host of slides for us, not videos back then, a whole host of slides. And as I was going through those slides, I came across this picture of myself as this 5-year-old, and I just made this little table. Now, the table was made out of a mani root and it had a 3x4 roughly nailed into the top of it. Nothing would stand on it. It was as unstable as they come. But I loved this table because it was something that I made. When I saw this slide, I can remember bursting out in uncontrollable tears. The sadness was extreme because I came to realise at that point that that was a trauma experience for me, and it created a lifelong problem that I didn't realise until that moment. The problem was that from that moment to this, I have never made anything with my hands. I had resisted it because the humiliation of being laughed at every time I made something was too strong for me. So I would avoid doing so because I wanted to avoid the pain. Now that may not seem significant to you, but it was to me, and it was deeply, deeply emotional. For many years I told that story in my anger management programs, and for many years whenever I told that story I still cried. We all have those sorts of traumas in our lives, and we need to understand them, and we need to sit with someone that can help us to work through them. Social workers have the same traumas. To not understand what those traumas are in our own lives and to not have a look at how they impact the way we work is malpractice. It's wrong. If the workers themselves were able to understand what it is they do and why they do it the way they do, based on their own experiences, and to evaluate them, their practice would improve out of sight. They'd become more understanding. They would listen. They'd be compassionate. The reason why they're not is because they don't understand their own traumas. Now, your job, if you're a parent watching this, is to try and understand your own and find someone that you can work with who will understand what's happening for you. to talk about these instances openly, to allow the emotions to flow comfortably, and to understand at the end of the day that by you doing this, you will change your behaviour forever. And I hope that social workers who may also be watching this may also come to the same realisation that you may be able to improve your practice by understanding the traumas that sit in your life. Thanks everybody. Thanks for being with me. Take care of yourselves and be safe.